Walter Hughes had worked in the same building for over 30 years. He cleaned floors, took out trash, and made sure the offices were spotless every night. No one ever noticed him much. People passed him in the halls without a smile or a hello, but Walter didn't mind. He liked his quiet life. He listened more than he spoke, and he watched everything. The building was huge, 45 floors tall. At the very top was the office of Harold Bancroft, the billionaire owner of the company. Everyone in the city knew Harold. He was rich, powerful, and very private. He rarely came to the office, but when he did, everyone acted nervous and serious. Walter had only seen him a few times, and always from far away. Still, he could tell that Harold was not an ordinary man. One rainy night, as Walter was mopping the marble floor on the ground level, he saw two men walking quickly into the elevator. It was after midnight, and the office should have been empty. Walter stopped his mop and looked. One of the men was wearing a dark suit and carrying a case. The other wore a white coat like a doctor. They went straight up to the top floor. Walter found it strange but said nothing. Over the next few days, Walter noticed more strange things. Boxes marked medical were delivered after hours. A strong smell of chemicals filled the service hallway on the 45th floor. And then news spread through the building. Harold Bancroft had died. It was sudden. No warning, no sickness anyone knew of. There would be a private funeral in a few days. No public viewing, closed casket only. Everyone was shocked. But Walter felt something else. He felt unsure. Walter remembered that just days before the announcement, he had seen Harold's shadow through the frosted glass of his office. He was walking slowly, but he was walking. Now they said he had died quietly in his sleep at home. It didn't make sense to Walter. He knew he had no proof. But something in his heart told him the story wasn't right. Late that night, Walter took the service elevator up to the 45th floor. He had his janitor keys, so he could get into almost any room. He walked slowly down the dark hallway, his cart rolling behind him. He paused outside Harold's office. It was locked, as expected. But next to the office was a storage room that had been recently used. Walter unlocked it and looked inside. What he saw made his heart pound. Inside were empty IV bags, oxygen tubes, and strange machines that beeped quietly. On the floor was a small, clear package labeled emergency sedation. Why would any of this be in a corporate office? Especially after the owner was declared dead. Walter picked up the package and put it in his pocket. He knew this wasn't normal. The next day, Walter tried to tell the front desk manager. He said he thought there had been a mistake, that Harold might not be dead at all. But the manager laughed and said, "Walter, I think you've been working too hard." No one wanted to hear a janitor talk about a billionaire's death. They thought he was crazy or tired. Walter walked away, but his heart was heavy. He couldn't forget what he saw later that evening. He sent an email to a local news reporter using a fake name. He wrote, "The man in the casket may not be dead," but he got no reply. Time was running out. The funeral was planned for the next morning. Walter went home to his small apartment, sat on the couch and stared at the wall. He looked around at the old pictures of his mother, his dog from childhood, and the Bible on the table. He had never done anything big in his life, never been the center of a story. But now he felt like he had to do something. If he was wrong, people would laugh, but if he was right, a man's life was at stake. He stood up, looked at his janitor uniform hanging on the wall, and made a decision. He would go to the funeral. He would stop it. No matter what anyone thought, Walter didn't sleep that night. His heart kept beating fast, his mind spinning in circles. He had made a decision, and there was no turning back. As the sun rose slowly through his window, he buttoned up his janitor uniform. He looked in the mirror, adjusted his cap, and whispered to himself, "Today you do something that matters." He left his apartment before sunrise and walked 3 blocks to the train station. The city was still quiet, as if the world didn't know what was about to happen. The funeral for Harold Bancroft was scheduled at 10 a.m. at Rosevale Memorial Church, one of the richest churches in the city. Only invited guests were allowed, the list full of billionaires, CEOs, and celebrities. But Walter wasn't on any list. He was just a janitor, and that's exactly what made him invisible. He carried a small backpack with him. Inside were the items he had taken from the storage room, the empty IV bag, the sedation packet, and a copy of the building's security schedule. He had also printed out a picture from the CCTV camera showing Harold being wheeled out, eyes closed, breathing tube attached. It didn't show a dead man. It showed a man who was very much alive. Walter arrived at the church and walked around to the back entrance. He saw caterers and cleaners moving in and out of a service door. No one stopped him. He blended in perfectly, carrying a mop and a spray bottle, acting like he belonged. Once inside, he made his way toward the private room where the coffin was being kept before the service. 2 security guards stood outside talking and sipping coffee. Walter waited for the right moment. Then he pulled the fire alarm in the hallway just beyond the room. As the alarm buzzed and the guards ran to check, he slipped inside quietly. The room was cold and still. The lights dim there in the center. Stood the coffin, dark oak polished with gold handles. He walked over, hands shaking, and slowly opened the lid. Inside, Harold Bancroft lay with his eyes closed. His skin was pale but not lifeless. Walter leaned closer, watching carefully. Then, he saw it, a tiny movement just under the neck, a pulse. Slow but steady, Harold Bancroft was alive. Walter covered his mouth to stop himself from shouting. He looked around the room and saw a small medical device hidden beside the coffin. It was keeping Harold sedated, not dead. Someone had planned this very carefully. He took photos with his phone and then quietly closed the lid again. Just as he turned to leave, the door burst open. The head of private security, a tall man in a black suit, stepped inside with 2 guards. "What are you doing in here?" he asked sharply. Walter froze for a second, then replied, "Cleaning, sir. They said to check the ventilation." But the man's eyes narrowed. "Get out," he said coldly, "and don't come back." Walter walked out quickly, heart pounding in his chest. He had proof now, real proof. But someone was trying hard to keep the truth buried. He went outside and called the same reporter he had emailed earlier, Naomi Wills. This time she answered. "I got your message," she said. But it sounded too crazy. Walter told her what he'd seen, described the equipment, and offered to send the pictures. She paused, then said, "Meet me at the cafe across the street in 10 minutes. At the cafe, Naomi listened carefully. She was a young reporter, always chasing real stories. She looked at the photos, her eyes wide with shock. "This could be huge," she whispered. "But if this is true, someone could be trying to kill him for real." Walter nodded slowly. "I think it's about money," he said. "And power." Naomi agreed and promised to help. But they had to act fast. Once Harold was buried, it might be too late. "I'm going to the press," Naomi said. "But it takes time." Walter looked out the window at the large church across the street. "I don't have time," he said softly. "I'm going back in." Walter stood across the street, watching the church as people began arriving in black suits and shiny cars. He saw cameras flashing, reporters waiting outside, and police officers standing at every corner. Important people were stepping out of limousines, talking into phones, holding umbrellas for each other, but no one looked at the janitor standing alone under a tree. No one ever did. He took a deep breath and looked down at his phone. The photos were clear, the pulse under Harold's neck, the medical machine inside the coffin, the IV lines tucked beneath the velvet pillow. It was all there, but what would he do with it? Naomi had promised to help, but she warned it might take hours for the press to respond. Walter didn't have hours. The funeral was starting in less than 30 minutes. And Harold, a living man, and was about to be buried. Walter walked back to the side of the church and knocked on the service entrance. A young woman in a black uniform opened the door. "I forgot my mop cart," Walter said calmly. "I need to clean before the service." She nodded without thinking and stepped aside. Once again, Walter was inside. He moved quickly but carefully. The hallway was busy now. Workers rushing to prepare the final touches before the ceremony. Walter tried to speak to one of the junior staff, a boy no older than 20. "I need to talk to the priest," Walter said. "Something is wrong," but the boy laughed and said, "Talk to security," then walked away. Walter tried again, this time with a woman arranging flowers near the altar.
"I need to tell someone. Harold Bancroft is not dead," he whispered.
She frowned, then shook her head. "Don't joke like that," she said. "It's not funny." Frustrated, Walter walked down a hallway toward the priest's office. He knocked on the door, and a tall man in white robes opened it. "Yes?" The priest asked kindly. "Please," Walter said. "You must stop the service. The man in the coffin is still alive." The priest's smile faded. "What do you mean?" he asked, now serious. Walter explained everything, the medical machine, the breathing, the photos. Walter stood across the street, watching the church as people began arriving in black suits and shiny cars. He saw cameras flashing, reporters waiting outside, and police officers standing at every corner. Important people were stepping out of limousines, talking into phones, holding umbrellas for each other, but no one looked at the janitor standing alone under a tree. No one ever did. He took a deep breath and looked down at his phone. The photos were clear, the pulse under Harold's neck, the medical machine inside the coffin, the IV lines tucked beneath the velvet pillow. It was all there, but what would he do with it? Naomi had promised to help, but she warned it might take hours for the press to respond. Walter didn't have hours. The funeral was starting in less than 30 minutes, and Harold and the living man was about to be buried. Walter walked back to the side of the church and knocked on the service entrance. A young woman in a black uniform opened the door. "I forgot my mop cart," Walter said calmly. "I need to clean before the service." She nodded without thinking and stepped aside. Once again, Walter was inside. He moved quickly but carefully. The hallway was busy now, workers rushing to prepare the final touches before the ceremony. Walter tried to speak to one of the junior staff, a boy no older than 20. "I need to talk to the priest," Walter said. "Something is wrong." But the boy laughed and said, "Talk to security," then walked away. Walter tried again, this time with a woman arranging flowers near the altar. "I need to tell someone." "Harold Bancroft is not dead," he whispered. She frowned, then shook her head. "Don't joke like that," she said. "It's not funny." Frustrated, Walter walked down a hallway toward the priest's office. He knocked on the door, and a tall man in white robes opened it. "Yes?" The priest asked kindly. "Please," Walter said. "You must stop the service. The man in the coffin is still alive." The priest's smile faded. "What do you mean?" he asked, now serious. Walter explained everything. The medical machine, the breathing, the photos. He showed the priest his phone, but the priest looked uncomfortable and stepped back. "This is a serious claim," the priest said, "but I cannot delay the funeral without proof from the family or authorities." Walter felt his chest tighten. "I am the proof," he said. "You have to believe me." But the priest only said, "I'm sorry," and closed the door gently. Walter stood in the hallway alone again. He looked at the photos on his phone, the truth in his hands, but no one wanted to see it. No one listened to a janitor. He wasn't a doctor or a lawyer. He wasn't rich or famous. He was just Walter, the man who cleaned the floors when everyone else had gone home. He walked outside the church again. Feeling the cold air on his face, the bell rang once, then twice, and the service was beginning. People were seated. Music was playing softly inside. The coffin was being moved to the front, and Harold Bancroft, alive but helpless, was going with it. Walter stood frozen, unsure what to do next. His phone buzzed, a message from Naomi. "Still no response from media, but I'm pushing it out now." "Be careful," he typed quickly. "No one is listening to me." "They're starting the funeral now." Then a voice behind him said, "Hey, you can't be here." It was a security guard, one of the same men who threw him out earlier. Walter turned around and held up his phone. "I have proof," he said. "You're about to bury a man alive." The guard looked confused, then annoyed. "Back away now or I'll call the police," he said firmly. Walter's heart was racing. He had done everything right. Tried to tell the staff, the priest, the press. Still nothing. No one believed him. And now they were minutes from sealing the coffin. Then, Walter did something bold. He ran, straight toward the side entrance of the church, past the guests, past the cameras, through the doorway and down the aisle. Voices shouted behind him. Security ran after him, but Walter didn't stop. As he reached the front, he pointed at the coffin and yelled, "He's not dead." The music stopped. Gasps filled the air. 2 guards grabbed him and tried to pull him away. "I have proof," Walter screamed. "Look at him. He's breathing." People stared, shocked and confused. Some thought it was a protest. Others a madman, the priest shouted for calm. The guards dragged Walter back toward the doors, but not before a young woman in the crowd raised her phone and said, "Wait. I saw that photo online." Chaos broke out inside the grand church. The organ music stopped, guests stood up in confusion, and the air filled with shouts and whispers. All eyes were on the janitor who had just crashed the billionaire's funeral. Walter struggled in the grip of 2 large security guards, his face red, his voice hoarse. But he didn't stop yelling, "Open the coffin, please. Just open it." The priest looked around, unsure what to do. People in black suits whispered to each other. One woman stood with her phone in the air. "I saw the photo," she said louder. "It's online now. My cousin just sent it to me." Several others began pulling out their phones. Checking the same post, a young man read out loud, "Harold Bancroft may not be dead. Evidence says he's in a medical coma." The head of the Bancroft Foundation, Mr. Clay Hammond, stood up near the front row. He looked angry, almost pale. "Get him out of here," he ordered the guards. "This is nonsense." But the murmurs had turned into questions now. "What if it's true?" someone asked. "Why would a janitor do this unless he believed it?" said another. Walter shouted again. "I saw the machines with my own eyes," he cried. "There's medicine inside the coffin. I took pictures. Look at them." A reporter from the back, who had just arrived late, ran forward. It was Naomi. She raised her hand and shouted, "I'm a journalist. I received the tip." "And I saw the evidence." Mr. Hammond's face darkened. He stepped forward and said calmly, "This man is lying. This is a planned disturbance." But Naomi stepped between him and Walter. "Then why not open the coffin right now and prove it?" she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Let's put the rumors to rest." People nodded. Even the priest looked uncertain. One of the pallbearers turned to the guards and said, "If it's not true, we lose nothing by checking." Mr. Hammond tried to stop them, but the priest raised his hand and said, "Let's bring peace to this moment by knowing the truth." Slowly, the lid of the coffin was opened. The room held its breath. Inside lay Harold Bancroft, eyes closed, lips pale, but not cold or stiff like the dead. Naomi moved closer. She pointed at the side of the coffin where a small machine blinked faintly. A soft sound of air moving could now be heard clearly. She leaned forward and whispered, "There's a pulse monitor attached to his finger." A doctor who had come as a guest stepped up quickly. He touched Harold's neck, checked his wrist, then looked at the crowd. "He's alive," the doctor said firmly. "He's in a medically induced coma." Gasps filled the room. Followed by silence, Walter closed his eyes. Tears forming as his body finally relaxed. He had been right, but it wasn't over. Mr. Hammond shouted, "This is a mistake. Someone gave wrong instructions. This wasn't supposed to happen." People began shouting back at him, asking questions. Who signed the death certificate? Why was there no autopsy? Who gave the order for a closed casket? Naomi turned on her voice recorder and aimed it at Mr. Hammond. "Who are you protecting?" she asked. "Or are you the one responsible?" Mr. Hammond backed away, but the damage was done. The truth had escaped. It was no longer a secret. The police arrived minutes later. They took over the scene and began asking everyone questions. Naomi gave them the photos and medical packet Walter had found. The doctor stayed by Harold's side, making sure his condition was stable. An ambulance was called to transfer him to a proper hospital. Walter sat on one of the side benches, his hands shaking. People came up to him. People in suits, people with cameras. Even strangers. Some said thank you. Others asked questions, but Walter just kept saying, "I did what anyone should have done." Naomi sat next to him and smiled. "You saved a billionaire's life today," she said softly. Walter looked at her and replied, "I didn't do it because he's rich. I did it because he's human." Across the church, a younger man in a sharp black suit was being questioned by detectives. He looked nervous, sweat shining on his forehead. That was Harold's son, Elliot Bancroft. He had arrived just before the service and stayed silent during the chaos. Now his silence had become a question. What did he know, and why had he said nothing? Walter watched him from afar. Something in that man's eyes looked cold, like someone who had expected today to go very differently. But things had changed. The truth had stepped forward, and Harold was alive. The ambulance rolled away from the church slowly, its siren silent, its lights flashing blue through the gray morning. Inside it was Harold Bancroft, no longer a body in a coffin, but a living man now under watchful medical care. People stood on the sidewalk still trying to understand what had just happened. The funeral had turned into a rescue, and the janitor, the man no one noticed, had become the center of it all. Walter stood quietly by the side entrance, watching the ambulance disappear into the city traffic. His hands were still shaking and his heart still beat fast. He wasn't used to people looking at him. He wasn't used to being the one who changed everything. But today he had done just that. News reporters swarmed the area, pushing microphones toward anyone in a suit. Did you know Harold wasn't dead? How do you feel about the funeral turning into a crime scene? Who signed the death papers? And most of all, who is this janitor? Naomi stood close to Walter, protecting him from the noise. She had already sent the full story to her editor, and within minutes it was going viral. Janitor saves billionaire from being buried alive, read one headline. Church shocker. Man declared dead was still breathing, said another. Pictures of Walter were all over the news. His mop cart, his uniform, his calm face. He had become a symbol, not of fame, but of courage. Inside the church, the guests had been asked to stay. The police were now questioning everyone. Detectives moved from row to row, asking what they had seen, what they had heard. At the front of the church, Harold's son, Elliot Bancroft, sat alone, his tie loosened, his hands clenched. The questions were getting harder. Why hadn't he visited his father in the hospital? Why did he agree to a closed-casket funeral? Why did he push for everything to happen so fast? Detective Ramos sat across from him, notebook in hand. Mr. Bancroft, do you know who signed your father's death certificate? Elliot cleared his throat. I trusted the doctors, he said. They told me he was gone. But did you see the body before the funeral? The detective asked. Elliot looked away. No, he replied quietly. I didn't want to remember him like that. Outside, Walter finally sat down on a bench near the gate. His legs were tired, but his mind was racing. He couldn't stop thinking about the moment he saw Harold breathing, about the silence that followed, and the look on everyone's faces when they realized he was telling the truth. People kept approaching him. A woman gave him a handshake and whispered, "You're a hero." A young man asked for a selfie. A little girl gave him a flower. Walter didn't know how to respond to any of it. He had spent his life in the background. Now he was standing in the spotlight. Naomi sat beside him, holding her camera. You did what no one else had the courage to do, she said. Walter shook his head. I almost didn't, he said. Everyone thought I was crazy. Security pushed me out. Even the priest didn't believe me. But you kept going, Naomi replied. You trusted what you saw, and that saved a life. In the distance, police officers escorted Elliot out of the church. Reporters shouted questions, but he kept his head down. He was not arrested, not yet, but everyone could see it. Something was wrong. Whispers about inheritance, money, and power filled the air. Some guests said he had rushed everything. Others said he seemed cold when the news came out. Walter watched Elliot walk past. Their eyes met for a second. Elliot looked away quickly. That glance said more than words. There was anger in his eyes, but also fear as the sun began to set. Naomi offered to drive Walter home. He looked at the church one last time, the place where the truth had finally come to light. Then he got into her car, still holding the flower from the little girl. On the drive back, Naomi asked, What made you keep going, even when no one listened? Walter looked out the window and answered slowly, Because I kept thinking, what if it was me in that coffin, alive but silent, waiting for someone to speak up? He paused. Everybody deserves someone to care, even if they're rich, even if they're powerful, even if they never knew your name. Naomi nodded and didn't say anything for a while. She knew this story was just beginning. Walter Hughes, the janitor who crashed a billionaire's funeral, had just stepped into a world he never expected. 3 days after the interrupted funeral, the whole country was talking about Walter Hughes. His face was on TV and newspapers and all over the internet. But Walter didn't care about the fame. He still cleaned his small apartment in the same careful way, still fed the stray cat outside his window, and still prayed before breakfast. All he cared about was whether Harold Bancroft would wake up. That morning, the news finally arrived. Harold had opened his eyes. His breathing had returned to normal, and doctors believed he would recover fully. The first words he spoke were quiet but clear. Where's the man who saved me? Back at the hospital. The room was filled with cameras and guards. Harold lay in bed, pale but alert, his voice rough from days of silence. He had no memory of the day he collapsed, only the vague feeling that something was very wrong before it happened. When Walter arrived to visit, Harold looked at him for a long time. You're the janitor from my building, he said slowly. Walter nodded, unsure what to say. Harold smiled faintly and added, Seems like you were the only one paying attention. They shook hands, and the moment felt quiet but powerful. Two men from different worlds connected by one act of courage. But while Walter was being praised, something darker was happening behind closed doors. Detective Ramos had opened an investigation into Harold's death, and what he found shocked everyone. The death certificate had been signed by a private doctor, Dr. Ellis Merton, but the hospital records showed Harold had never been officially declared dead. In fact, his file had been altered, vital signs were erased, and his emergency contact, Harold's personal assistant, had been removed. The deeper they looked, the more they found. It was not just a mistake, it was a plan, carefully created and hidden. At the center of it all was Elliot Bancroft, Harold's only son. Elliot had been given control over certain family assets in case of Harold's death, with a legal clause that said if Harold died suddenly, Elliot would gain full access to the company within 72 hours. The funeral had been scheduled exactly 48 hours after Harold's collapse, and the coffin was meant to be buried before anyone could ask questions. Detective Ramos gathered documents, emails, and phone calls. He found a trail leading back to Elliot, bank transfers to the private doctor, pressure placed on staff, and messages that suggested Elliot had been planning a takeover for months. But the biggest clue came from an anonymous message sent to Naomi. It was from someone inside the company. The message said, "Check the smart pill bottle in Harold's office." It wasn't for vitamins. Naomi and the police went to Harold's private office at the top of the tower, behind a hidden panel in the desk. They found it in a small white bottle labeled Memory Boost, but inside were pills used for deep sedation, strong enough to keep someone unconscious for days. Tests showed traces of the drug in Harold's blood. It had been slipped into his tea. The night before he died, Harold was shocked when he heard it all. "My own son," he said softly, "tried to bury me alive for a company." Walter sat beside him. Listening quietly, he didn't speak, didn't judge. He just sat with the man he had saved. Harold turned to him and asked, "Why did you do it, Walter? You could have walked away." "No one expected anything from you." Walter looked out the window, then answered, "Because something didn't feel right." He paused. "I've cleaned that building for 30 years. I know every shadow and every silence," and he looked back at Harold and added, "When I saw that delivery box and smelled those chemicals, I knew it wasn't death, it was something else." Harold nodded slowly. "You trusted your instincts and it saved my life." He reached into the drawer beside his bed and pulled out a file. "I've started making changes," he said. "You'll be the first person on the new board of ethics at Bancroft Holdings." Walter blinked. "Surprised, I'm just a janitor," he said. Harold smiled. "Not anymore." The hospital press room was packed. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder. Microphones pointed at the long table in front of them. Cameras clicked like heavy rain, and news anchors whispered into live broadcasts as they waited. Behind the curtain, Harold Bancroft was sitting in a wheelchair, wearing a gray suit and a calm expression. He looked older than people remembered. But wiser too, Walter Hughes stood beside him, nervous in his neat janitor's uniform. It was pressed clean and tucked in properly, but still just a uniform. He didn't like attention, and yet here he was, about to stand next to one of the richest men in the country and speak into 1,000 cameras. "Just be yourself," Harold whispered to him. "You already did the hardest part." The curtain opened slowly, and the crowd went silent. Harold wheeled forward, followed by his new legal team and Naomi, who now worked as his press advisor. Walter walked quietly to the side and waited. Harold took the microphone and spoke slowly. "3 weeks ago I was nearly buried alive," he began. A wave of shock moved through the room, even though they already knew the story. "But I'm not here to talk about betrayal," he continued. "I'm here to talk about the man who stopped it." He turned slightly toward Walter and smiled. "This man, Mr. Walter Hughes, saved my life when no one else believed me still alive. He's not a doctor, not a lawyer, not a man of power, but he is a man of truth, and that matters more." The room burst into applause. Flashes lit up the walls, and reporters leaned forward to capture every word. Harold raised his hand, and the room fell quiet again. "I've made decisions," he said. "There will be changes at Bancroft Holdings. My son, Elliot, will no longer be part of the company. He is under investigation and will face whatever justice decides." Whispers rose in the back of the room. One reporter stood and asked, "What's next for Mr. Hughes?" Harold smiled and gestured to Walter. "Walter will serve as our new head of ethics and facility oversight. He will have full access to every floor, every department, and every voice that feels unheard." Walter stepped forward. Unsure what to say, he looked at the reporters, then at Harold. Then he took the microphone and cleared his throat. "I didn't do this to be thanked," he said quietly. I didn't do it to get a job. I did it because it was right. Sometimes you see something wrong, and you just know you can't walk away. The room was silent as his voice echoed through it. He looked down at his hands, rough from years of cleaning floors. I was invisible for a long time, he said, but now I'm not. And I want to use that for something good. After the press conference, Walter and Harold were driven to the Bancroft Tower. The building looked the same, tall and shiny, full of people rushing in and out, but something had changed. People nodded at Walter, smiled at him, opened doors for him. He wasn't just the janitor anymore. When he reached the top floor, the elevator doors opened with a soft chime. The office Harold once ruled from was now being redesigned. Walter walked past the glass walls and saw workers painting, removing old portraits and replacing gold frames with simple wooden ones. Harold's orders. The company needed to feel human again. Not like a palace. Walter's new office wasn't large, but it had a wide window and a wooden desk. On the desk sat a framed quote that Harold had picked for him. Power means nothing if it forgets the people below. Later that evening, Walter sat in his small apartment. He hadn't moved out. Even though he could now afford better, the same stray cat waited outside his window, and he fed it like always. His phone buzzed with messages, offers, and interviews. He ignored most of them. Instead, he called his sister, who lived 2 states away. She cried when she heard his voice. "I saw you on TV." She said, "Mama would have been proud." Walter smiled gently. "I just did what she taught us," he replied. "Tell the truth. And don't ever be scared to stand alone if you have to." At the hospital, Harold watched the recording of the press conference again. He turned to Naomi and said, "He's the kind of man I should have hired years ago." Naomi nodded. "Sometimes," she said, "you have to nearly lose everything to see who really matters." 1 year had passed since Walter Hughes stopped the funeral that shook the whole country. The city was different now, but so was Walter. He still wore simple clothes, still took the bus when he wanted quiet, and still drank his coffee black with 2 sugars. But when he walked down the street, people smiled at him. They nodded, waved, and sometimes even stopped to say, "Thank you for reminding us that one voice can matter." Walter had never asked for attention. He had never asked for fame. But his story had traveled far, from TV shows and podcasts to school textbooks and documentaries. People called him a hero, a miracle worker, even a guardian angel. But Walter didn't see himself that way. He was just a man who paid attention when others didn't. At Bancroft Holdings, Walter had built a new department called the Listening Office. It was a small team made of former security guards, cafeteria workers, receptionists, and cleaners. Their job was simple: to report concerns, not from the top floors, but from the bottom ones, and to make sure no voice went unheard again every month. Walter walked through each floor of the company without warning. He didn't hold meetings in glass rooms or talk through email. He sat beside the workers, shared lunch with them, asked about their families, and listened. And because of him, the company changed. It became more human, more honest, and far more respected. Harold Bancroft had recovered fully. He returned to work slowly. Not as a ruler, but as a listener, he often told people, "If you want to know how strong a building is, don't ask the ones in the penthouse. Ask the ones cleaning the foundation." Harold and Walter became close, not as boss and employee, but as friends. They shared quiet talks about life, trust, and second chances. Harold even invited Walter to his home for Sunday dinners, something that had never happened in the 30 years Walter had worked in his building. One afternoon, Harold asked Walter to join him in his private garden. As they sat under a tree, Harold said, "I've changed my will." Walter looked over with surprise. "You didn't have to do that," he said. Harold smiled. "I didn't do it for you," he replied. "I did it for what you stand for." He handed Walter a folder. Inside was a new plan for a foundation, the Hughes Fund. It would provide scholarships, housing, and legal support for low-income workers across the country. It would be run by people like Walter, not lawyers, not politicians, but honest workers who understood real life. Walter's hands trembled slightly as he closed the folder. He looked at Harold and said, "Why me?" Harold answered without thinking. "Because when I was most alone, you were the only one who didn't walk away." Months passed, and the Hughes Fund became a real light for many. Young students whose parents worked as cleaners or cooks were now attending college. A janitor from Detroit became the board leader of his building thanks to a Hughes grant. A cafeteria worker in Texas saved her home using legal support from the fund. Walter traveled quietly from city to city, meeting these people, hearing their stories. He never brought cameras, never gave speeches. He just listened, and each time, he left behind a little hope, back in his old neighborhood. Walter still lived in his small apartment. He had been offered mansions, big cars, even TV shows, but he turned them down. He liked the quiet. He liked waking up to the sound of birds and feeding the same stray cat that still waited outside his door every morning. One evening, as the sky turned orange and gold, Walter sat on his front steps with a notebook. He wasn't writing a book, not really. He was just writing down thoughts, memories of his mother's advice, funny things from the office, and names of people he never wanted to forget. At the top of one page, he wrote, "What matters most is not what you wear or where you sit, but what you do when no one is watching." A neighbor's little boy walked up and asked, "Are you the man who saved that sleeping rich guy?" Walter chuckled and nodded. The boy sat down and asked, "Can I be like you?" Walter closed the notebook and smiled. "You already are," he said. "You just have to care enough to try."